So, Grant, maybe kind of let's start with a very high-level question. Just the fact that you've been two very large organizations, HSBC, McAfee, one is a financial institution. Maybe just provide kind of a high-level thinking. What's different in terms of cybersecurity aspects across those two organizations?
Just recently with HSBC, so just a little background and gives you a little perspective. I had about 1,500 people working for me with $1 billion budget with a B. In 68 countries, a lot of regulators. So that gives you a little bit of a flavor of what I was dealing with. McAfee was interesting. Smaller team. I also ran the labs organization, all the research, data science, artificial intelligence, whatever the buzzword is today, and was the CISO. And part of that was also managing the billion sensors that McAfee had. So I think it's interesting when you look at perspectives. I think McAfee has taught me a lot about breaches, right? So I think, in the time I spent there, I saw every breach for 3 years. So whether it was something a customer would deal with, I saw kind of the responses. So almost every breach for 3 years, I saw it. And then I think when I went to HSBC, I think you saw the scare of the board, the executives, leadership on cyber. And I think when you kind of look at this, what it does make me think, and kind of reflecting back on these two organizations, you really got to get foundational controls right. Even SolarWinds, I think SolarWinds has talked a lot about, the threat actor, but at the end of the day, people are injecting code into your GitHub. You're compiling it and rolling it out. It's probably not a real advanced attack. So I think when you look at these things and trying to operationalize a program like HSBC is really trying to get your foundation right, looking at proactive controls, what type of things you can do, and then really being selective with what you can do with predictive analytics. And that's kind of the in-house machine learning. We can talk a little bit about that. And really trying to get it. But I think even more importantly at the big companies, and even the place I finally got my offer today, I can't say what it is, but what it comes down to is really being able to articulate risk from a probability and impact standpoint, and then trying to leverage some of the frameworks and controls around how you actually can do that.
Grant, this is really helpful. So you mentioned the board of HSBC, and kind of one of the things we discussed before. I think it's going to be interesting here to hear about it. So what are the expectations of HSBC board from a CISO?
So they're awful at best. So I maybe have had pretty good boards. HSBC, so if you think about it, you have a group board, and then you have probably 3 main countries we operated out of: US, UK, Hong Kong. So and I think that's interesting. I think when you look at expectations, the expectation is that you have there's really 3 things, and you can steal these. I think they're very important. You got to be able to articulate risk. You got to be able to have a program that you can show that you're executing. And 3, you got to monitor that you're reducing risk and that you're making progress across control environment in the program. So that's the expectation they give you. How to do that is the hard part, right? Because you have a group board, 68 countries with leadership, C-level people, and then you got regulators that come up, and then your principal regulator over. So what's most interesting in these bigger organizations is how do you get that governance right and trickle down so you consistently can have the same message across the country. Or across the globe. And why that's important is that a lot of the regulators will ask, a smaller country like Taiwan, even though they're small to an HSBC, the regulators still care, and the people in the country still care. And if the executives do not understand what the cyber strategy is in Taiwan or Argentina, even Israel, it bodes negatively for the organization. So making sure that, one, you kind of go through those 3 things, but making sure you have a really good governance structure that articulates that message very swiftly is super key.
How do you think this will change over the course of the next 5 years? Or it's going to be the same expectations?
I think it's going to get more and more. I've been interviewing, which I think is interesting, as I'm trying to find the right spot for me as we kind of move back and taking some time off to spend with my 2-year-old. And what I'm consistently hearing is board, level, the CISO roles being elevated into a little bit higher level or peer level with the CIO, and the board and the executives are very concerned with it. So what's going to happen is you're going to get more time and more interface with the board, and with that comes a lot of responsibility. So what I've seen in a lot of jobs is that the CISOs, relationship with the board and executives is poor, and that's why they're replacing them. So I think as you think about this, it's good to be, I always think, despite what some of these crazy other CISOs say, I think it's still good to be technical and understand what you're doing. But part of being technical also is making sure you can convey that message to the board and the executives extremely well in those three areas, because that's what they really want to see. And one of the board members of this job that I'll end up taking, that'll be public in the next couple of weeks, was talking about one of the other board seats that he sat on, that all the CISO wanted to talk about was maturity, right, and compliance. And what I told him was maturity and compliance will get you breached very quickly. So, but I think a lot of us have taught the board's executives that some PwC model or some other model comes into effect, and that's good. It doesn't actually have any articulation of risk or if we could be impacted and how ready are we to be impacted. But I think as you guys think about this, the board's going to be important. And even the other thing I'll even say, customers are going to be important, because I think you're getting a lot of people ask about what your security posture looks like.
Kind of moving to a topic that I don't think it was really ever discussed, but I think it's one of the top of the minds of a CISO is hiring and recruiting, because I feel like everyone is looking for professionals. There's constantly lack of people at SOC or in other positions, security engineering, and so on and so forth. So how do you think about that? How does it work in large organizations? How do you search for suitable candidates?
So, I think in larger organizations, I mean, if you take the kind of 1,500 people, it's a little bit, it's easier to manage when you have that many people, but you also have, if you think 10% turnover a year, maybe 20%, if you're doing well in the CISO world, you're probably 8%. You've seen it as high as 25%. So when you start turning over teams, it's a problem. So I think, the other thing I'll say is, I'm not sure how grounded our industry is on having good quality cyber people. So, and I say that only in the sense that if you think about, for the last 20 years, all we've seen is breaches. Are we a successful industry? I don't think so. Two is the people that we're hiring may be old school in their thinking. So I think when I think about talent, I'm really trying to think about, people that are interested in this, that devote themselves to learning, and then very curious in the way they think, and curious on kind of challenging status quo functions. So, and I think that's important. So I actually like to do a lot of diversity inclusion and really focused it on I'll call it the younger people in their career that maybe aren't so biased and stuck in their ways, because I think you see that in a lot of organizations. And I've seen this while interviewing. Well, this is the way we do it. I'm like, well, that's going to get you breached. And I think when you think about this, it's really making sure you get a good cultural fit that challenges, that can work through it, and then bringing some experienced people that you do think that are good. And I'll give you my favorite interview question, which is, you can do it if you're cloud faced. I've done this since 2004. The same question. It's awful. If I could even volunteer somebody to go through it, it's an awful question. But you could do it in the cloud. You could do it anything. And if you said, hey, in GCP, build a secure network, what would you do? That's an awful question. And see how they think. And so I like to do that, because there's really no right answer. If they say, I do NAT, well, how do you do NAT? What is NAT? What does NAT look like? What is a firewall? Well, I'll put a firewall. How's that work? Is it stateful? What do the connections look like? Is it a layer 2, layer 3? Those are the things that I think are interesting to get them to think about those challenges. If they don't know, then you probably understand real well. But, and back to probably your question before, the board's concerned about people as well. So I think in this, when you look at it, make sure you get the people stuff right. And I would overinvest on people and underinvest on tooling to really drive that program forward.
So you've been in this business for 20 years. Would you say that the quality of talent became better or changed?
I think there's a quantity of talent. Quality, I think there are people. I think it's still, I would even say even in every organization that I've been in, there's still probably a handful of people that are still the key decision makers. 5 or 6. So if you all think about your teams, how many, if you have a team of 20 or 5 or 2, who are the people that are doing it? It's probably on a hand that you really trust and really are driving the strategy, the execution, the oversight, those things. So, even an organization of 1,500 people, it was maybe on 2 hands, but it wasn't substantial. So what you're trying to do is build, I think, taking your leadership and building sustainable process, sustainable capabilities, sustainable ways of thinking about how we deliver projects and outcomes from those handful of people, so that it's more of an executable thing within the organization where you can teach and they can kind of learn from it.
Yeah, that's helpful. So moving to the next topic, let's talk about buzzwords. And one of the buzzwords lately is shift left teach developers security. It's kind of so how do you think? Is it even possible to make developers be cautious about security?
So I don't like the word shift left, and everybody uses it because it's just a maturation of process, right? So, and I think shift left is really a view of how do you speed to the business, right? How do you help accelerate? So in one of the organizations I worked with, I won't say the name, it took 33 days from the time code went from dev to production through cyber. So pretty unacceptable. So is that shift left that we needed to do it? Well, I think about it and say, well, how do I actually make this sustainable process through it? So what does shift left mean to me? Automation of everything that's in the development from a cyber. So I think shift left, what it ultimately is, how do you streamline the process to support it? So in that organization, we went from 33 days to basically on demand. Is that shift left, or is that being smart about how you enable the business to deliver product through the normal sustainable thing? So I think the challenge with dev, if you guys have been in this industry and gals have been in the industry a long time, so I always think like early 2000s, we started teaching networking people and server people and storage people how to do security, but we kind of left the developers alone because they didn't really touch anything in production, right? So, and one of my favorite conversations I ever had was early back of how do you put an OWA server on the internet, and the Exchange admin said, just open all the ports to it and all the ports back onto the internet. And, I'm like, well, that's an awful idea. And she didn't even understand the ports from the DMZ out and the DMZ in. And we're now going through this again with developers. 15 years, 20 years later, developers don't understand this. And I think that the analogy, my brother's been at US Bank for 20 years. He's a Java architect. And he said, I went to AWS class and they taught me storage and networking. That's not cloud. I said, well, what you're missing is that is cloud, because cloud is basically giving the developers an interface into managing firewall rules and managing storage, managing clusters, managing infrastructure, right? So, when we shift left, we're actually saying, how do we, my mind with cloud is we have to automate all of this, and we got to work in partnership with the devs to help do this, and think about it that way. So we enable the business, not hinder with our awful process. And I think it's interesting, even in the time, the last job, it was like, we're going to take our premise-based tools and stick them in the cloud. That doesn't work, and I think, it's, well, if I'm using binary authorization and I'm, doing container scanning, why do I need to run all these other tools that we have premise-based? So, but that's kind of taking that mind shift and saying we actually need to automate this process to help dev, not the other way around, and really enable it. So I think that's a key thing.
So continuing on buzzwords, what do you think going to be the next generation of buzzwords that will need security? And I'll give you an example. So we're now starting to see low code, no code as the next buzzword that suddenly requires the security.
Oh, You threw me for a loop on that one. I didn't have that. That wasn't in the cheat sheet. I think the thing that we're going to start seeing is CISOs probably managing more risk across an organization. I think product-wise, there'll be products that will come up. I mean, you're going to have this shift to the left with, how do you basically automate processes in the cloud? I think that will always be there. I think that's going to be the if I had to put my money, I'm investing in cloud and I'm investing in doing it the right way. And I'm investing in automation versus these traditional premise things. But I think what that's going to do is allow us to be more internet or more business facing and more risk oriented. And I think you're seeing that with the digital trust. I think you're seeing that with almost in some ways, CISO's taking on resilience. What I think about resilience was what they called, 15 years ago, resilience was disaster recovery and business continuity. Now resilience is the same thing. It's just automating it. So it's actually a little bit of a cycle with it. But I think they're going to lean on us more on risk and how do you do it? Because I think we think about that in general.
Got it. So maybe one more question on my end, and then we'll open this for Q&A. So us as investors, when we meet companies, we always think whether this is going to be a point solution or this will become a large company. And then we have a conversation with CISOs, and we kind of we hear, we really wanted to consolidate all those vendors. And we had these conversations 2 years ago. There were like 30 vendors on average. Now, probably if I ask you guys, there's going to be like 40, 45. The number increases. So can you explain this, thing that on one hand, you're saying, we want to have a consolidation. On the other, there's like, we're buying more.
So yes. So I think it's interesting, right? Having bought a lot of products in my lifetime, and then being at McAfee, which was fascinating, right? So I think you look at, I always kind of like the analogy. I'll use it from Endpoint because it's fascinating. Even McAfee started as antivirus, and then they became the largest cyber company. Now they're in 12 different pieces and all over the world. After the recent things. And I think same thing with Symantec or Broadcom, and I think you're seeing this out of the ABs. They were originally endpoints that have become these massive organizations. So I think you'll always see that, the big people buy point products, right? We bought SkyHigh when I was there. There was a couple consumer things. We bought Tunnel Bear. There was a few other little kind of niche products that they bought that kind of incorporated into the technology. And I think it's because the big people don't have the innovative people or the mindset or the leadership to do it. So so I think what ends up happening is now you end up with, hey, look, two of the hot, startup endpoint companies are Israeli based, right? So with SentinelOne and Cybereason, and I think probably the other one's CrowdStrike. And I think what happens is you see, if you think about McAfee, it's fascinating because, and if anybody's running it, we had two platforms, the ENS platform and the VSE. VSE had been around for years and years and years and years. And we had, I think they were putting $20, $30 million just into maintaining the platform for customers, right? So you can't, that's just collecting revenue, maintenance agreements because customer didn't want to do it. And then you had this new ENS platform was maybe taking a third of that and trying to invest. So what you ended up having is a diluted pool of innovation that actually didn't work. And what you saw, the only way I see some of these big people innovating is buying other companies and bringing people in. But then what happens is they end up leaving. You just saw this with Rajiv leaving from SkyHigh, and he'll start something else. So I think what you'll see is, it'll be interesting that they'll acquire. But I think when you find these innovative companies, and take a SentinelOne or Cybereason, and they have that innovation, they have the leadership, and they have the talent, they can surpass the bigger people if given the right probably product mix and the leadership to do it. And then it's how do you expand it? So if you think about CrowdStrike's probably a good example. They've started to venture out into the other world, and they really knocked down the kind of big three in the AV world. And I think you saw that with Palo, with taking down Cisco and Checkpoint. Not as much Checkpoint, they're still big, but Paolo's kind of done that. I think with Zscaler's another one that they've kind of taken on Blue Coat. So you wouldn't think that, but I think when you look at it, if they have better products and they have the scale, as much as we hate the marketing people and everything's artificial intelligence, but it does matter, because I think Paolo's done a good job on that. I think that Zscaler's done a good job with it, and you've seen these smaller companies become ginormous because I think the talent within the innovation and the leadership that's been brought in the company. And I think what you see is then what happens is even the top people, if I even think about some of the McAfee stuff, giving you guys a little insight, a lot of my top people as McAfee, I left, but a lot of my top people as things started to look different for McAfee in the future left. They went to CrowdStrike, they went to Cybersecurity. So, my top automation developer in labs who basically built sandboxes for every piece of malware, and could run it through in about 30 seconds and pull out static feature vectors, dynamic feature vectors, and tell us what was going on, is now CrowdStrike. So I think you even see that where you can start to attract that talent because the buzz is so good. But I think it goes back to CrowdStrike wouldn't have been there, SentinelOne wouldn't have been there, Cybersecurity wouldn't have been there if the product wasn't better. And I think that goes back to the people and kind of that vision of where it falls.
So kind of just continuing on that. So SentinelOne IPO this week. And there are probably going to be a few other companies. So who would you say are the next wave of currently private companies that will become, the next Zscaler, Okta?
That's a good, I don't know. I wish if I bet on them. The one market, I think the market around and protecting our employees is interesting. I know you guys just acquired a company around that are doing that. I think that's interesting. I think that, I think it'll be cyclical. At some point, there'll be a new endpoint company, there'll be a new network company as you go through it. I do think if we think about shift left a little bit, call it that, much as I hate it, the world of Google, Azure, and AWS is interesting because I think they're starting to build their own tools. I think we're seeing that. So they're not the small people, but they're bigger. And I think if you can get embedded into that ecosystem of what that looks like is very interesting. So, because if I can embed that into a process that's seamless is very good. I know Splunk's done a good job with GCP on it. I always say the name wrong, Sync, S-Y-N-K, the app dev company that's doing cyber is pretty cool. But I think their valuation's over $1 billion at this point, so they're not really small at that point either. So, but I think it's a market that I would pay close attention to and who's there and what's going on and kind of the product features. But I think for me, it's always been about the efficacy of the products and how well they're helping, and then that ultimately will drive, the capability to replace the bigger boys.
Thank you. Very interesting. So, guys, and everyone. Let's open this for Q&A.
I guess I can start. So, from your experience, what do you think is, let's say, the top risk in 2021, 2022, let's say, for a CISO to actually handle, to be engaged?
So it was a little echoey. So you said the top risk CISOs faced in 2021. Is that what that was?
Yeah, 2021, 2022.
What do you think will be the top risk?
So risk or more tactical kind of vulnerability kind of capabilities?
Let's say both.
I think risk being a general business term, I do think you're seeing much more. I think the ransomware people figured out how to get paid. I do think is interesting because they finally wised up and said, well, if I only ask for $5 million, they'll pay me. If I ask for $50 million, they won't. And they'll get the FBI and all these other people involved. So, we've already seen it twice in the last month of 2 people paying off before it really became public. I think we're going to see more of that because it's worked. Attackers do things that work, I think, which kind of goes into what I think the biggest vulnerability has, and I think it's one that people wildly understand, and it's probably been like this since 2017, 18, is like ports open on the internet. Now that sounds awful, right? But if you think about, people allowing RDP, it's still the #1 avenue for access into organizations. Same thing with, Telnet SSH, and, like my favorite vulnerability scanners don't flag it as a vulnerability. It should be a very easy query. It says if public address in 1433 is open, it's a critical vulnerability and you should be fired type thing. But, and so I think that's one that I consistently see, because I always think, there's only, like, to get breach is very simple. I always think everything's simple, right? So in order for a breach to happen, 3 things have to happen: something connects, something runs, and something goes back outbound. Well, if I get access to something, that makes my job a lot easier. And I think you see, and I saw this at McAfee, I had many customers complain to me about, McAfee software didn't stop it. I'm like, well, you let them in, like, through RDP. Well, what do you want me to do? Like, you allowed them access in. So I think that world of access in open ports around access is super key. And then I think the ransomware is only going to continue because the attackers are getting paid. So.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I've got a question. It's much more practical. It goes back to the first question. Can you hear me okay, Graham?
Yeah.
Okay. So you were talking about presenting to the board. You're talking about presenting the risk. This might sound silly, but what tools, what sorts of way do you amalgamate risk and present it in such a way that it's regularly occurring? How, very tactical, how do you show it? Is it just an Excel sheet? Is it a PowerPoint somewhere? Let's see if you've got it handy, right?
Let me see if I can actually, so for this, if you give me 2 seconds, I will show it. I got to make one tweak to this thing and I'll show you what it looks like, because I think it's super important to do. Let me pull the name of the vendor, the company off. Let's see if this works. If you see the name, so be it. So this is one of the slides I've used historically. Now this is kind of the entire framework of everything. So don't worry about this here. But where I really like to have this conversation, it's fair, but fair sucks. That's a different conversation. So I think for, what I'd like to see more is more investment in understanding risk and articulating risk. I think it's an underserved market as I think about it. But this conversation with board goes a long way, which is your probability of loss in dollars. And what I did talk about a little bit earlier is these foundational, proactive, and predictive. And these are kind of your investment channels. And where do you make the investments to kind of lower the curve of the risk? And what I would say is that executives, mostly made up of business people, lawyers, accountants, do understand risk extremely well. They don't understand cyber. They don't need to understand cyber. But if you can articulate risk and curves and probability and how you do things, it goes a long way. So so what I've been able to do over the time at HSBC, I built my own modeling. And for actually, while you guys were having drinks, I was actually coding as you laugh, because I'm building my own model that's based kind of on Fairmiter and NIST with some control ways and metrics and analytics to support my own view, because it's not real good. So, but I think when you get to this, if you can get to this conversation, it becomes far more important. So this is kind of the first slide I usually show. The second one's really around, and I don't have a draft of it, is really around the program. What are the outcomes you're driving to? And then how well are you progressing on it? Are you over budget? Are you under budget? Are you delivering the outcomes? What's the timeline? How are you making viewpoints? And I think becomes super important. And what I will say is the chart that I think works best, it kind of goes into the risk and threats, is if you're able to articulate your risk and your threats and then show the controls that are in place, not in place, and how well they're operating for each one of them is very important. They're not going to care that, you know, you put in browser isolation, or you did this, or you bought whoever it is, right? You know, I just put in, you know, Menlo and you know, CrowdStrike. They don't care. What they care is, are you mitigating the threat that's the risk, and then being able to give it kind of an operational view with how that works. So those are the two things I typically like to show, because, you know, executives just don't understand cyber. So if you say, here's my risk, here's what we're doing, here's our impact, here's our program that's mitigating, and here's what we're doing, I think that's the key message you want to have. And they may ask you some crazy off the wall question, and they will always. But I think being able to articulate that in a business terms is super important to do.
Yeah, that was really useful. Thanks.
Maybe one last question. Anyone?
Yeah, maybe I'll take it. One of the curious questions that I've been, you know, thinking about lately is the structure of the security organizations, right? And how do you think it's going to evolve in the near future? There are various reasons of why I think it's interesting. One of which is obviously the tool stack, and maybe touching several questions that Pavel asked about the roles and hiring and the shift left. And so I'm curious about what do you think about it? And maybe one thing that I tend to think about it as one option is take the product organization as an example, which at the beginning, there used to be a separate product team in each company. And nowadays we see product people, product managers being embedded in each R&D team, right? So that's kind of one option that I foresee for the security organizations, kind of to have their representative shift left in the R&D team, in the networking team, versus what it is right now as a separate kind of department. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so org design's interesting, right? So, and there's, you know, I'm relatively passionate because I think if you can get one, if you go back a little bit to what risk you're facing and what the program is, you know, over the next, you'll probably know, the next 2 or 3, 4 years, you're going to have to go here. Enabling your organization, having an organization that supports that is going to be super key. So that's one thing I always think about. 2 is, and it's something I did at HSBC that was really wise, otherwise it will fall on all of you to do, is building kind of a transformation office. I think most jobs that we're doing, there's a lot of change and there's a lot of moves. So to your point on how do I actually have a program that can run and make sure that you're not the one in the middle of doing everything is key. So I built a kind of transformation office that had product managers in that would drive what we needed to do, strategy function, you know, looking at budgets, accounting, and making sure I had roadmaps that were done. Because what ends up happening, the engineering people don't want to do it, and they call the other people stupid, and it's this big mess. So I think those 2 things are super key to execution. Now, I think when you get into the question you asked around shifting left dev, you know, you traditionally have architecture, engineering, and maybe operations. Last role, I started consolidating ops and engineering, so you didn't have this pointing the finger and having one person, but those organizations can get very large. That organization would have been probably 600 people, 700 people when it was all said and done. So that's a lot for one person to do with a lot of tooling. So it changes your skill set in where you are. Now, if it's smaller, it could be a lot easier to integrate it. And then I think your point on hiring dev and this, how do we start to embed architect level people within these DevSecOps teams? I mean, it really needs to be DevSecOps, because it can't be just DevOps, because, you know, they're going to do these. I mean, I just went through this Google Fellow program where hopefully I'll get it, where there's only 40 people that are going through that Google appointed as an external fellow for cloud. So I've been very immersed into cloud. And what I realized about cloud is it's way too complex. I wish I'd have done this earlier. For most infrastructure and dev people to do on your own, if you don't have a cyber person really looking at how you do it, especially with the advent of Istio and some of the stuff that's going on, you got to have people embedded into those organizations. So as my investments, you know, you used to see these massive investments in, you know, engineering, massive investments in SOC. What I started to do is to pull them out, right? Is if you take I'll pick on my old company, McAfee, that, you know, is premise-based, slow, hard to roll out, to a SentinelOne or CrowdStrike. you can actually reduce that load off those teams to start to make those investments into the business line, which is really where you need to go. But the problem is you got to get the right tools and the mindset to do it within those organizations and the structure. So I do think that is important. And then actually, I think the other thing is that with this DevSecOps is making sure you get the organization structure right within the cloud interfaces of what cyber's doing and what the rest of dev is doing too, and making sure that that relationship's there, because you don't want dev opening things that they shouldn't. So, and that's going to be a lot different skill set. So I think even this, I think us from, pushing buttons to moving into code is where we have to go. Because I think, the security platforms are doing a little bit better job of solving the complexity of 5 or 10 years ago that we used to have. But we have to get more people closer to the business, closer to that code, and more simplistic in nature. That's a long answer. I could probably talk about that for hours.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. It was extremely interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.